A black woman is pulled over by a racist cop who starts accusing her of things she didn't do. With his aggressive questioning and unfair treatment, the situation quickly escalates. But what happens next will leave you in shock. Instead of getting intimidated, she uses her knowledge and quick thinking to outsmart him in a way he never expected. Stay tuned to see how she flips the situation and how karma hits hard when the cop realizes he's been exposed. The car slowed to a stop, its engine humming in the stillness of the afternoon. The woman had barely noticed the police car behind her, its sirens flashing suddenly in her rearview mirror. She had been lost in her thoughts, reflecting on the long day she'd just endured at work. But now her calm drive home had taken an unexpected turn. The officer stepped out of his vehicle, his posture stiff and rigid, a typical image of authority. As he approached her window, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze. There was an air of arrogance about him, as though he already knew who she was, as though her presence alone was a reason to question her. Without saying a word, he leaned down toward the window, his eyes scanning her face and the interior of her car. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, his voice laced with a condescending tone. "No, officer," she replied calmly, handing over her driver's license and registration. The tension in the air was palpable, but she stayed composed. She knew this was just another routine traffic stop, or so she thought. He glanced at her paperwork, and then back at her, his gaze narrowing in suspicion. "You were speeding," he said, his voice sharper now. "I'm going to need you to step out of the car." The words hit her like a punch. Something about the way he spoke didn't sit right with her. She had been calm, hadn't raised her voice, but already she could feel the unfairness creeping in. This wasn't just about a simple traffic violation. It was the way he was treating her. With an obvious prejudice, she hesitated, but then stepped out, determined not to let the situation escalate. The officer seemed to relish in his power, clearly enjoying his position. But she wasn't backing down. As she stepped out of the car, the officer circled around her, his eyes never leaving her. The tension in the air thickened as he barked more orders at her. But his words felt more like an accusation than instructions. "Turn around," he said sharply, his hand hovering near his belt as if he were expecting something to happen. She didn't flinch. She had seen his kind before, the ones who use their power to control, to belittle, to judge based on nothing but assumptions. "Is there something wrong, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice calm, controlled. Her pulse quickened, but she refused to show it. "You were speeding," he repeated, his words now a bit too forceful, like he was trying to justify his actions. "And you're going to make this difficult, aren't you?" The woman, still composed, thought about how she had barely been going over the speed limit, certainly not enough to warrant the officer's treatment. But she knew that pushing back could escalate things, so she kept her movements slow and deliberate, trying to maintain control of the situation. He ordered her to step aside, continuing his probing questions, none of which made sense. "Where are you coming from? What's your business in this area?" His questions became increasingly invasive, and she could feel his gaze on her more intensely. It was clear now. This wasn't about speeding. This wasn't about a traffic stop. This was about his assumptions, his biases, and his determination to treat her as if she didn't belong in a space that, by law, she had every right to be in. The woman, growing tired of the harassment, stood her ground. She wasn't just going to give in to his intimidation tactics. Instead of responding with fear, she calmly asked, "Am I being detained, officer?" The question caught him off guard. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He stammered for a moment before trying to regain his authority. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just cooperate." But she didn't move. She stood her ground, calm and poised. She knew her rights and wasn't afraid to assert them. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said steadily. "I have nothing to hide. But I'm asking if I'm being detained or if I can leave. Your behavior is not justified, and I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal." The officer's hand twitched near his holster, a dangerous sign, but she didn't back down. She knew better than to show fear. Instead, she pulled out her phone, casually starting to record. "If you're going to accuse me of something, I want it on record," she said, her voice unwavering. The officer's demeanor shifted, his arrogance giving way to a slight, uneasy tension. He had assumed she was just another person he could push around. He wasn't prepared for her to turn the tables on him so smoothly. His eyes narrowed as he realized what she was doing. "You really want to make this public?" he sneered. "You think this is going to help you?" "Yes, I do," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "I think it's important to be accountable for your actions. And I think you should be held accountable for the way you're treating me." Her words cut through the air, and for a moment the officer hesitated. He wasn't used to this. He was used to people complying, cowering under his authority. But she wasn't backing down, and now she had him on record. He took a deep breath and stepped back, his earlier aggression turning to frustration. "I'm letting you off with a warning, but don't think this is over. You've been warned." His words, laced with an undertone of threat, were meant to intimidate her. But the woman wasn't fazed. She held her phone up, making sure the recording captured every word. "Thank you for your time, officer," she said, her voice dripping with politeness, but carrying the weight of someone who had just won a small victory. "I'll make sure this gets to the right authorities." He scowled, clearly realizing he had been bested, but there was nothing he could do. She had handled the situation with grace and intelligence, outsmarting him at his own game. He was now the one on the defensive, and the woman knew it. As she got back into her car and prepared to drive off, the officer remained silent, watching her with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. He had underestimated her, and now he was left to confront the reality of his own actions. The woman drove away, her heart still racing, but a sense of victory coursing through her. She hadn't let him intimidate her. She hadn't let his assumptions dictate her response. She had stood tall, calmly fought back, and used her knowledge to assert her rights. And as she drove away, she knew that for once the tables had been turned. As the woman drove away, her mind raced, still processing the encounter. But as she turned the corner, she noticed something in the rearview mirror. The same police car. The officer was following her. She tried to stay calm, but a wave of unease crept over her. Had he decided to retaliate? Was he going to try to pull her over again? She made a quick decision, taking a sharp turn into a more populated street, hoping to lose him in the traffic. But no matter how many turns she made, the police car stayed right behind her. He was determined to get the upper hand, and it seemed like he was looking for any reason to escalate the situation further. With her heart pounding in her chest, she kept her hands firmly on the wheel, trying to think quickly. She knew this wasn't just a simple case of a mistaken stop. It was personal. He had tried to intimidate her, and now he was trying to make her feel unsafe. But she wasn't going to let him have the satisfaction of seeing her scared. After another couple of turns, she slowed the car down and pulled over to the side of the road again. This time, however, she made sure to park in front of a busy cafe with a large outdoor seating area. As soon as she stopped, she grabbed her phone, her fingers moving quickly to hit record again. She wasn't going to let this man take advantage of his position without facing the consequences. The officer pulled up behind her, his siren still silent. As he stepped out of his car, she could feel his anger in the air, his every step an attempt to regain control of the situation. But this time, she was ready. He approached the window again, this time without the same confidence he had before. His demeanor had shifted. There was frustration in his eyes, mixed with something else, hesitation. He had already tried to intimidate her, but it hadn't worked. And now, the woman was making sure he knew it. "Are you serious?" the officer spat as he leaned down to the window. His voice was low, and there was a distinct edge to it. "You're still recording me? After everything?" She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. "Yes, officer. I'm recording. I have every right to. And I'd like to make sure this interaction is on record." He gritted his teeth, stepping back and giving her a moment's silence, clearly weighing his options. The busy cafe patrons nearby had noticed the standoff, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding. The woman could see the officer glancing toward them, clearly feeling the weight of their attention, the pressure building. "You think you're some kind of hero now?" the officer sneered, his voice rising. "You're just wasting my time." She stayed calm, leaning forward slightly, her voice measured and firm. "No, officer, I'm not a hero. I'm just a person standing up for my rights, and I won't let anyone, especially someone in a position of authority, disrespect me for no reason. You had no cause to stop me, and you definitely had no right to escalate things." His anger flared as he stepped closer, his chest rising and falling with every breath. But as he looked around and saw more people gathering to watch, he hesitated, his bravado faltering. The woman could see it in his eyes. He had expected her to back down, but instead she was challenging him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, the officer's radio crackled, and his attention shifted. He hesitated, almost reluctantly, before taking a few steps back. He spoke into the radio, his words quick and clipped, barely masking the irritation in his voice. "Fine," he muttered, clearly defeated. "It's not worth it. I'm letting you go. Just don't make me stop you again." The woman didn't respond immediately. She waited a moment, ensuring that the interaction was over before slowly rolling up her window. She had won. The officer, though still visibly frustrated, had no choice but to back down. She didn't feel the need to gloat. Instead, she simply put her car back in gear, starting the engine and driving away with her head held high. As she merged back into traffic, she saw the officer's car in her rearview mirror, still there, but no longer pursuing. She had stood her ground, and he had recognized that she wasn't the easy target he had hoped for. The moment was a small victory, but it meant so much more than that. It was a reminder of the power of remaining calm under pressure, of knowing your rights, and of challenging those who misuse their authority. The woman had not just outsmarted him. She had taken back control of the situation that he had tried to manipulate, and that, in itself, was a win. As the woman continued her drive, she couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter was far from over. It had been tense, but she had made it out unscathed, her dignity intact. The officer had backed down, and she'd been able to walk away with the knowledge that she had stood up for herself. But in the back of her mind, there was still an uneasy feeling that something bigger might unfold. What she didn't know was that the recording she had taken, something she had intended as a personal safeguard, would soon become the catalyst for a much larger chain of events. As she arrived home and played back the footage, she saw the moments in clearer detail, realizing just how much the officer's conduct had been inappropriate. It wasn't just about her personal experience. It was about the way he had been using his power to intimidate and target people like her, simply because of her skin color. Feeling a sense of responsibility, she uploaded the video to a public platform, not expecting much more than to share it with a few people she knew. Within hours, the video went viral. The footage, though raw and unpolished, captured the essence of the encounter in its entirety. The way the officer had refused to let the situation die down, the condescending tone, the way he tried to provoke her, all of it was there, plain for the world to see. The community began to take notice, and the story caught fire. People began sharing the video, their outrage growing as they watched the officer's actions unfold. Within a day, the hashtag number Justice for Her began trending. People across social media platforms expressed their support for the woman, condemning the officer's behavior and the way he had mishandled the situation. Some shared their own experiences of racial profiling, while others pledged to take action, demanding accountability. But it wasn't just the public reaction that made the difference. The video made its way to the local news, and soon enough, the story of the racist cop and the woman who had outsmarted him was featured on major news networks. The coverage brought the issue of racial profiling into the spotlight in a way that no one had anticipated. Legal experts weighed in, pointing out that the officer had violated not just the woman's rights, but also basic principles of fair treatment under the law. As the story gained momentum, the officer's department was forced to investigate. The public backlash was so overwhelming that they couldn't ignore it. Internal Affairs launched a full review of the officer's record, and it didn't take long to uncover a troubling pattern of complaints against him. This wasn't the first time he had been accused of racial bias or misconduct, and the public pressure was mounting for real consequences. What happened next shocked everyone, including the woman who had stood up to him. The officer was placed on administrative leave while the investigation continued. The community demanded more, a complete overhaul of the department's policies on racial profiling and accountability. The woman's single act of standing her ground had sparked a revolution of sorts, inspiring others to share their experiences and demand change in a system that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for too long. Meanwhile, the officer's behavior was scrutinized even further. More footage from previous traffic stops and incidents was uncovered, showing a disturbing pattern of aggressive and biased behavior. The department couldn't ignore the growing evidence, and soon they had no choice but to take serious action. The officer was eventually fired, and his case was sent to court. The woman, in her quiet victory, never sought out fame or recognition. But the ripple effect of her actions was undeniable. She had taken a stand, had calmly outsmarted a racist cop, and in doing so, had set off a wave of change. Her willingness to record the encounter, to stand up for herself, and to share her story gave others the courage to do the same. The system was beginning to change, one step at a time. And in a small way, the woman had played a part in that shift. Her video was not just a personal victory, it was a public statement that things could no longer be allowed to continue in the same way. As the officer faced the consequences of his actions, the woman reflected on the greater meaning of what had happened. It wasn't just about her victory. It was about how the smallest act of standing up could turn into something much larger, something that could change the system for the better. What started as a traffic stop, something that could have gone unnoticed, had ignited a movement for accountability, justice, and equality. And as the officer faced his downfall, the woman knew one thing for sure. The fight for justice was far from over. But with each victory, with each story shared, the world was inching closer to the change that was so desperately needed. The aftermath of the officer's dismissal was swift. The once confident man, who had believed his badge protected him from accountability, now faced the full weight of his actions. The department, shaken by the public backlash and the viral video, had no choice but to act. Internal investigations revealed a long history of complaints about his behavior, and it became clear that his actions were not isolated. This was not just an isolated case of a power-hungry officer. It was a reflection of a larger issue within the system, a system that had allowed racial profiling and mistreatment to fester unchecked. The woman, still adjusting to the whirlwind that had followed the incident, watched from the sidelines as the officer's career disintegrated. She had never asked for any of this. She had simply stood up for herself in a moment of injustice, using her knowledge of her rights and the power of documentation, but in doing so, she had become the catalyst for something bigger. Her small act of defiance had exposed the cracks in the system, and it had forced people to pay attention to the pervasive issue of police misconduct. The officer's dismissal was just the beginning, and though the victory felt sweet, the woman knew that it wasn't enough. The system was deeply flawed, and this single victory wouldn't change everything, but it was a step in the right direction. As the news spread, so did the discussions about racial profiling and the role of law enforcement. The video had sparked outrage, but it had also ignited a powerful conversation. Activists, legal experts, and everyday citizens began to speak out, demanding more comprehensive changes in policing practices. The case of this officer became a symbol of what happens when a community decides they've had enough. It was a reminder that standing up for what's right, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, could lead to real, tangible change. For the woman, it was a moment of reflection. She realized that while she had faced hostility and prejudice in her life, she had never been as directly confronted with it as she was that day. The officer had assumed that because of her race, because of how she appeared, she would cower in fear. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had paved the way for his own downfall. Her confidence, her calmness, and her knowledge of the law had been the tools she used to defeat him. But it wasn't just about outsmarting him. It was about reclaiming her agency. She had also learned something deeply personal through this encounter. The woman realized that it wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about standing up for the countless others who had been wronged in the same way. She knew that her victory wasn't just her own. It was for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, every person who had ever been targeted because of the color of their skin. Her actions were a reminder that no one should have to suffer in silence, and that standing up against injustice can make a difference. The community, too, had taken note. People who had once stayed silent began speaking out, sharing their own stories of police misconduct and demanding accountability. It was as though a veil had been lifted. People were no longer willing to accept mistreatment without speaking up. The woman's courage had become a rallying cry for justice, and the changes that followed were significant, though small in the grand scheme of things. But as important as this victory was, the woman knew the fight for justice wasn't over. The police officer's dismissal was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. So many systems that needed reform, so many minds that needed to be changed. But now, with the officer's actions exposed, with the conversation being had on a much larger scale, the woman felt a renewed sense of hope. Her small act of standing her ground had changed the trajectory of her community. She had used her voice, her knowledge, and her courage to take a stand, and in doing so, she had sparked a movement. The message was clear. No one, not even a police officer, was above the law. No one could be allowed to misuse their power without consequence. And the woman, though humble in her victory, knew that her role in this larger story was just the beginning. As she continued her daily life, the woman became more involved in community organizing, using her experience to help others stand up for themselves. She spoke at rallies, shared her story with others, and worked to ensure that those who had been wronged could find the strength to fight back. Her actions had sparked a broader movement, one that would continue to grow. The moral of the story was simple, but profound. The fight for justice, equality, and respect was ongoing, but with each person who stood up, the change became possible. The woman had outsmarted the racist cop that day, but the real victory lay in how her courage had created a ripple effect, one that would inspire others to take a stand against injustice wherever they saw it. The woman's story was just one chapter in a much larger movement, but it was a chapter that showed the power of standing up against injustice. Her courage, calm demeanor, and knowledge of her rights had not only outsmarted a racist cop, but had set into motion a broader conversation about accountability, racial profiling, and the need for change within the system. Though the victory was sweet, she knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice would continue, and it would take every person willing to challenge the status quo to make a difference. Her actions were a reminder that one person's bravery can spark change, and that standing up, even in the face of fear, can help make the world a better place for everyone. So, we ask you, have you ever stood up for what's right, even when it seemed like the odds were against you? How do you deal with injustice in your own life? Let us know in the comments below. We want to hear your stories of resilience and courage. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us all of the power of standing up for justice, equality, and fairness. Every voice counts, and together we can help change the world, one small victory at a time. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video, where we continue to shine a light on the stories that matter.